What if the most important waterway on Earth just stopped working? Not for a week, not for a month, for nearly half a year and counting. Before you go any further, hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear is not old news repeated with a scary voice. This is what is actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz today, and almost nobody outside the shipping and oil industry fully understands how serious it has become. Let's start with the simple picture, because once you see it clearly, everything else makes sense. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. At its tightest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. That's it. That thin gap is the only sea route out of the Persian Gulf. Every tanker carrying oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar has to pass through it to reach the open ocean. For decades, that made it the single most important choke point in the global economy. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through those 21 miles. When people talk about a place where a small country can shake the whole planet's economy, this is the place they mean. Now here is where the story turns serious. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on Iranian military targets. Those strikes included the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. That single event changed everything. It wasn't a limited strike anymore. It was a direct hit on the top of the Iranian state. Wikipedia. Iran's response came almost immediately. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz to all foreign shipping in retaliation for the attacks. This wasn't a vague threat issued by a spokesperson on state television. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began transmitting direct radio warnings to ships in the strait, telling them plainly that no vessel was allowed to pass. Within days, hundreds of vessels and thousands of sailors found themselves effectively trapped inside the Persian Gulf, unable to leave, unable to deliver their cargo, just sitting there while the world watched oil markets shake. Wikipedia +2. A few days later, Iran made its position official. On March 2nd, the Revolutionary Guard confirmed the strait was closed specifically to nations it considered unfriendly, while still allowing vessels it approved to pass. That is a crucial detail. This wasn't chaos, it was control. Iran wasn't randomly attacking ships. It was deciding day by day who got to move oil and who didn't. That is exactly the kind of leverage a country dreams of having over the entire planet. Wikipedia. The United States did not sit back and accept this. On March 19th, American forces began an aerial campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones. Weeks later, the U.S. established a naval blockade against Iran starting April 13th and ran additional operations through early May. This was not a symbolic show of force. This was a real sustained military campaign fought over control of 21 miles of water. Wikipedia. And the cost has been real too. According to tracked figures from the crisis, at least one tugboat was sunk, more than 17 merchant ships were damaged, with several abandoned entirely, 2 merchant ships were captured, 12 seafarers were killed or went missing, and a port worker in Bahrain was killed with 2 others wounded. These are not statistics from a hypothetical scenario. These are real ships, real crews, real families waiting for news. This is what a closed choke point actually costs when nobody backs down. CNBC. Now, right here is where I want you to pause and think about something. A lot of channels are telling you a very different story right now. They're telling you that new pipelines quietly built over the last few years have already solved this problem, that Gulf oil now flows around Iran completely, that the strait doesn't matter anymore, that Iran has lost all its leverage and is sitting there panicking over a card it can no longer play. It's a satisfying story. It sounds like the good guys clearly won using clever engineering instead of a costly war. But when you actually check what is happening in the news this week, that story falls apart almost immediately. And that gap between the exciting version and the real version is exactly what we're going to dig into next. If this kind of fact-checking is what you come here for, tap that like button now. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos that don't just repeat whatever sounds dramatic, and instead go find out what's actually true. So let's look at what the real numbers are saying right now, because they tell a very different story than Hormuz doesn't matter anymore. In April 2026, the U.S. and Iran reached a ceasefire. It looked for a moment like the crisis might be ending. A memorandum of understanding was signed in June 2026, and part of that agreement involved Iran committing to use its best efforts to allow safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait. That sounds like progress, but notice the wording, best efforts. Not guaranteed access, not full reopening, just an effort. And Iran has leaned hard on that specific wording ever since, arguing that this language actually gives it the right to control shipping through the entire strait, something it had never formally claimed before. CNN+2. Then in July 2026, the fragile peace broke down again. Fighting resumed after Iranian forces attacked commercial ships that Tehran considered non-compliant with its own demands. So even during the supposed calm period, Iran was still treating the strait as something it controlled, something it could open or close depending on whether ships followed its rules. CNN, fast forward to now. Mid-August 2026, here's where it gets genuinely revealing. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz has been severely constrained since the fighting began in late February, and it remains that way today. The strait has been effectively closed by Tehran this entire time, despite President Trump repeatedly insisting that it is open and under Washington's control. Read that again. The American president is publicly saying the strait is open. Iran is publicly saying it is not. And the actual shipping data backs up Iran's version, not the president's. Wikipedia. Why does that matter so much? Because the International Energy Agency has warned that reopening this waterway is becoming increasingly urgent as the world burns through its oil stockpiles at a rapid pace. Let that sink in. This is not some regional inconvenience anymore. Global energy reserves are being drained because one narrow strip of water has been effectively shut for close to half a year. If a permanent bypass network really existed and really worked, none of this would be happening. Stockpiles wouldn't need to be burned through. The IEA wouldn't be sounding alarms. The math simply doesn't support the bypass story. Wikipedia. And what about oil prices, the number that tells you the truth faster than any press release? On August 12th, Brent crude was trading close to $89 a barrel, on track for its sixth straight daily increase as Iran hardened its position over control of the strait. The International Energy Agency noted that benchmark crude prices swung across an unusually wide range of almost $40 a barrel in July alone, driven by sudden diplomatic shifts in the conflict. That kind of volatility is the signature of a market that has no reliable alternative route. If Gulf oil could simply flow around Iran through some finished pipeline network, prices would have settled months ago. Markets hate uncertainty, and they would have priced in the bypass the moment it became reliable. Instead, they are still swinging wildly every time Tehran or Washington makes a new statement. Nucenaire. Just one day later, on August 13th, the picture stayed just as tense. Oil prices actually dipped slightly, with Brent around $87 and WTI near $81, even as both Iran and the United States hardened their claims of controlling the strait. Around the same time, Iran's own Persian Gulf Strait Authority issued a statement declaring that American claims the strait is no longer blocked do not change reality, and that Hormuz remains blocked until Iran's conditions are accepted. This is a government agency, created specifically around this conflict, standing up and saying on the record that the closure is real and ongoing. That is not the language of a country that has lost its leverage. That is the language of a country that believes it still holds the most important card on the table. Wikipedia CNN. There is also a diplomatic track running in parallel, and it's worth understanding because it shows just how contested this still is. Iran and Oman have both signaled optimism about reaching an agreement on how to manage navigation through the strait. But even here, Tehran has been quick to make clear that any such deal would not mean an immediate return to normal shipping traffic. And separately, Iran's own government has stated plainly that until the United States, in their words, corrects its behavior, the Strait of Hormuz will not be reopened. So even the country that is supposedly desperate to make a deal is the one setting the terms for when or if the water reopens. That is not a country in panic. That is a country negotiating from a position it clearly still believes is strong. CNN+2. And it's not just about the strait itself anymore. The conflict is trying to spread outward. The Houthis, an Iranian-aligned group, have threatened to widen the conflict across the wider Middle East. In response, Saudi Arabia signed a NATO-style mutual defense pact with Turkey and Pakistan, aimed specifically at strengthening its position against Houthi threats. Iran, for its part, dismissed that pact, saying it wouldn't actually guarantee the kingdom's security. Even inside Washington, the appetite for continuing this fight appears to be wearing thin. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has reportedly told other administration officials privately that the United States needs to find an off-ramp from this war. When the country's most senior military officer is quietly pushing for an exit, that tells you something about how costly and unresolved this situation has become, even for the side with the far larger military. CNN+3. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a picture that is honestly more interesting and more important than the fantasy version. There is no secret pipeline network that made Iran's geography irrelevant overnight. There is a real, unfinished war, a choke point that has been effectively shut for months, an economy burning through emergency reserves, oil prices swinging by tens of dollars a barrel in a matter of weeks, and two governments publicly disagreeing about basic facts on the ground, while soldiers, sailors, and civilians pay the price in the meantime. If you're finding this more useful than the version that just tells you what you want to hear, do me a favor and share this with one person who's been following this conflict. Not for the algorithm, because the actual story deserves more attention than the exaggerated one. Let's talk about why the pipeline bypass idea is so tempting to believe, even though the facts don't support it right now. It's true that alternative routes exist. Saudi Arabia does have the East-West pipeline, running from its eastern oil fields to the Red Sea coast, built decades ago as a backup during an earlier era of tension with Iran. The UAE does have a pipeline running crude to the port of Fujairah, sitting outside the strait entirely. These are real pieces of infrastructure, and Gulf states have every reason to keep investing in them, because relying on one narrow waterway controlled by a rival is obviously a strategic risk nobody wants to carry forever. But there is a massive difference between these alternative routes exist and provide some backup capacity, and these routes have completely replaced Hormuz and made it irrelevant. The current numbers don't support the second claim. If bypass capacity had truly overtaken the strait's role, we would not be watching the IEA warn about draining global stockpiles. We would not be watching oil prices swing by $40 a barrel in a single month. We would not be watching two governments argue in real time over who actually controls the water. Alternative pipelines help. They cushion the blow, they give Gulf producers some breathing room. But cushioning a crisis is very different from ending one. There's also a deeper point here about why geography still matters, even in a world full of pipelines and satellites and precision weapons. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane, it's a symbol. And in a conflict like this one, symbols carry real weight. Every time Iran declares the strait closed, it is making a statement to its own population, to its regional rivals, and to the wider world that it still has the power to disrupt something the entire planet depends on. Giving that up, even if alternative pipelines existed, would mean giving up a piece of identity that Iran's leadership has built its regional strategy around for decades. That's not something that gets erased just because a rival country builds a new pipeline. It gets erased, if it ever does, through negotiation, exhaustion, or outright military defeat, none of which has clearly happened yet. And here's the part that should really make you sit up. Even the country that supposedly stands to benefit the most from all of this, the United States, isn't confidently declaring victory either. If the strait were truly irrelevant, if the bypass network had truly worked, American officials would be saying so loudly, using it as leverage in negotiations as proof they had already won without needing Iran to give up anything. Instead, what we actually see is a president insisting the strait is open while the shipping data says otherwise, a top general quietly pushing for a way out of the war, and an energy agency warning that the world's fuel supply is running dangerously low. None of that is the behavior of a side that has already achieved a clean, permanent engineering solution to Iran's geographic leverage. That is the behavior of two exhausted sides, neither fully able to force the other's hand, with the rest of the world caught in the middle, paying higher prices at the pump while they figure it out. So if you came here expecting a story about a quiet, clever infrastructure project that instantly ended Iran's power, I understand the appeal. It's a clean story. It has a clear winner. But the real story is messier and honestly more human. It's a story about a strait that has been effectively closed for nearly 6 months. It's a story about seafarers who got trapped in the middle of a war they had nothing to do with. It's a story about oil markets swinging wildly because nobody, not Iran, not the United States, not the shipping companies, actually knows what happens next. And it's a story about how 21 miles of water can still, even in 2026, hold the entire global economy hostage, no matter how many pipelines get built around it. Before we wrap up, here's something worth thinking about long after this video ends. For 50 years, people have predicted that new technology, new pipelines, new alternative routes would eventually make choke points like Hormuz obsolete. And yet, here we are, watching a modern war fought partly over control of that exact same 21-mile gap. Geography doesn't get replaced as easily as headlines suggest. It gets negotiated around, worked around, occasionally bypassed in part, but rarely made irrelevant. Iran's leaders understood that when they closed the strait in February. The United States understood it when it launched a military campaign specifically to reopen it. And global oil markets understand it every single day the strait stays effectively shut, one price swing at a time. So the real question isn't whether Iran has lost its leverage. The real question is how much longer both sides can afford to keep fighting over it, and what the rest of the world will look like economically and politically by the time somebody finally blinks. If you want to actually understand what's happening in this conflict as it unfolds, instead of chasing whichever version sounds most dramatic that week, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is nowhere near finished, and the next turn could change everything you just heard.